Hey everyone, welcome to our virtual open house. We're really sorry we couldn't meet you in person today, but we're going to have a really good discussion. And I just want to introduce the different people that are going to be talking today. So first, we have Andrew.
Hi, my name is Andrew Walsh. I'm an associate professor in criminology. I've been teaching at Wilfrid Laurier now for about 14 years, and I'm also the associate dean in the Faculty of Human and Social Sciences.
Aaron.
Hi, my name is Erin Day. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology. I've been here 3 years and I study homelessness and social exclusion.
Stacy.
Hi, I'm Stacy Hannum. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Criminology and the department chair. I've been at Laurier for 11 years and I study sex work and the implications of the criminal justice system for marginalized people.
And I realized I never introduced myself. I'm Tony Christensen. I'm the undergraduate officer for the criminology department, and I too have been here for 11 years. So we're gonna have a really good discussion today, so let's get started. And we're gonna start with this little guy, right? The whole reason we're having to meet virtually this year. We're gonna start by talking out a little bit about COVID. And you might be thinking, what does COVID have to do with criminology? And you might be a little tired of talking about COVID and hearing about COVID, but we think it's really important actually that we are, as professors, and that our students are, are engaged with the world and what's going on around us. So we wanted to talk a bit today about COVID and how it relates to criminology, which I know probably sounds weird because we think that COVID is something that biologists or chemists or doctors and sometimes, fortunately, unfortunately, politicians should be talking about and handling. But how does it relate to criminology? Well, as it turns out, there's a lot of ways that it relates to criminology, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So why should we talk about criminology or talk about COVID? Well, one of the things to do is it's going to be a window into getting to know the department, right? We're going to talk about how each of us approach COVID and how it's relevant to the type of research we do. And by doing this, you get a sense of our personalities, you get a sense of our interests, and we're more than just names on a webpage. And you'll get to know our department a bit better. Another reason we want to talk about this is it gives you a sense of how we're training our students and how we're helping our students to think about and approach their experiences in the world. By talking about something that doesn't seem on the face of it related to COVID or related to criminology, you'll see that we're teaching our students and we encourage our students to engage with all aspects of the world, to use criminology as a launching point for engaging with the world critically in a way that we think is actually valuable, regardless of whatever career that they pursue, right? We need people who are engaged in the world, who are curious about the world, who ask questions of it. That's a valuable skill. So I'm the one that gets to go first. I get to talk about my interests first. I have a different sort of interest in criminology. I'm not actually interested in what drives people to commit crimes or how we prevent crime. What my interest actually lies in is figuring out why we think certain things should be criminalized and why we think other things shouldn't be, and why some behaviors that were previously not problematic have become crimes and become criminalized later, and why things that used to be a crime no longer are. Like if you think about the legalization of marijuana, a behavior that used to be criminalized no longer is. And my interest in this stems from the fact that the patterns we see here and the processes that lead to certain things becoming crimes and other things not, it's not random. There's a pattern to the way that these things become criminalized or decriminalized. And what I'm particularly interested in is how different people in different groups try to persuade us to view something as problematic and as a crime, or persuade us to that, it should no longer be criminalized. And what I look at is how they tell stories to us to try and convince us, and how they tell us stories about what the harms of the activities are, how they tell us who's hurt and who the victims are, and tell us who the villains are and who's to blame for these different things, and why sometimes that catches the public's interest and it gets them very, very concerned. And other times people just don't seem to care. And now the topic for today is about COVID. And what I'm going to talk about is something that a year ago, absolutely no one would have thought of as related to crime or, having to call the police about it. And now they do all the time. And what that is wearing a mask, right? A year ago, no one cared about this. But this is a great illustration of how what we consider criminal and not criminal changes over time. And we can look at with this the stories of how people have argued that this should be a crime for not wearing a mask or that it shouldn't be. And before anyone tries to like catch me here and say, well, it's technically not a crime, Dr. Christensen, it's a bylaw and things like that. I mean, you're right, but we have seen lots of examples though where like the police are getting involved and having to enforce the mask requirements. And so what I'm interested with this though is not whether they're right or wrong about, people who think we should wear masks are right, people who think that we shouldn't wear masks are right or anything like that. What I'm interested in is how they're trying to persuade us to believe them and what their arguments are and what the stories they tell are. Because there's a couple of different stories going on here, and I'm going to really briefly summarize it. When we look at mask wearing, the first summary, or the first story, is the idea that we have a responsibility to protect each other, that we need to wear a mask to stop us from harming each other, and especially to protect those who are most vulnerable, like the elderly and the frail. One of the other stories that we're hearing is the idea that the mask requirement infringes on our rights and that we should resist this because it's another attempt by the government to subdue us. There's other stories related to these about why we should or shouldn't wear masks. But what I want to point out about these is we see different victims and different villains in each of these, right? In the first story, we see that the victims are portrayed as elderly people who can't protect themselves, right? Who are highly at risk, and we have a responsibility towards them. And then the villains are the people who are careless and only care about themselves and don't wear masks. In the second story, the villains are the government and the victims are actually all of us who are having our rights taken away, who are being subdued by the government. These are different stories that are going on related to this simple thing of wearing a mask that a year ago no one even cared about, but has bubbled up to the surface now. And we see these types of stories, and I don't particularly care who's right or wrong. What I care about is who's persuasive and who persuades us and the public to believe them. And what we see in each of these stories, again, is stories of what's the harm, who's the victim, who's the villain. And we always see these stories emerging when we're talking about criminalizing things, whether we're talking about the legalization of marijuana. You see competing stories. One story talks about the risk to our children, right? There's our victim, the children. If we legalize marijuana, they'll have more access to what was portrayed as a gateway drug to harder drugs, and we're putting our children at risk. And we see the story about this victim. Like in the other story about wearing masks, we had the frail elderly people who couldn't protect themselves. With marijuana, we have our children, again, who are innocent and can't protect themselves. The other story with marijuana, though, about legalizing it, why it should be legalized, some of the arguments were related to undermining the illicit profits that organized crime get from this drug, and that the money that instead goes to taxes and that will benefit us from people using this thing that everyone's already using. And again, there's stories about harms and benefits, victims and villains in each of these stories. We can look at sex work and whether sex work should be legalized or not. And people who argue that it should be legalized say that by keeping it illegal, it puts sex workers at risk. They're more likely to be victimized by violent villains. On the other side of that story, we hear people telling stories that we need to keep it illegal because if we legalize it, it will increase the risk of human trafficking. And again, stories of victims, villains, things like that. And in each of these, I'm not trying to argue, I'm not saying who's right or wrong. Some of these arguments you're probably hearing go, oh, that's bull. And I might agree with you privately, but in the research, it's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in why do these stories persuade us? Why do we find some victims sympathetic? Why do we find some villains condemnable, bad people, and we agree with the stories that we're being told? So that's the sort of thing that I look at. That's how COVID is related to criminology for me. So, having said all that, I'm going to pass it off to one of my colleagues. I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Welsh. And thanks for joining us today.
Hello, my name is Andrew Walsh, and I'm an associate professor in criminology. I've been teaching at Laurier Brantford now for about 14 years. I'm also the associate dean in the Faculty of Human and Social Sciences. So to continue our discussion, and we've been looking at how criminology is more than just policing and corrections and explanations or theories of crime. It's a fairly broad program, and the types of things that we can touch on in our courses are pretty extensive, which makes it very useful and also engaging for prospective students. So to continue our focus on how criminology might be applied to or relevant to COVID-19, I'm going to look really briefly through the lens of one of the courses that I teach, which is called Crime, Media, and the Law. It's a third-year course. We cover a wide range of issues. In general, we look at how crime and justice issues are selected for media coverage and how media coverage tends to represent those crime and justice issues. One of the lectures that I do is on social media, and we look at social media from a variety of ways. So for example, we look at it from the lens of how police misconduct has been caught more and more frequently over the last, say, decade with people on their smartphones. Live streaming things, and then how the social media has been used to cover protests in ways that are very different from how mainstream news media does. There's also the kind of phenomena of people not only confessing to crimes on social media, so posting things on Instagram, for example, but actually live streaming themselves, engaging in illegal activities on YouTube pages, for example. I'm not sure, maybe TikTok. You can tell I'm older, I'm less familiar with that social media platform. What I want to look at really briefly, and you can look at the slide here, these are just screenshots from different, most of these are Twitter pages. One in the top left-hand corner is a case from earlier this year on a Facebook post. So as we've shifted to a new normal with COVID-19, required mask bylaws, requirements to self-isolate if you're experiencing the symptoms, in addition to having formal ways to kind of control people, so giving bylaw officers the ability to find people that have large social gatherings. We've also relied very heavily on informal social control measures. And what I mean by an informal social control measure is the idea that it's not formal surveillance, it's not the police, it's not a specific law. It could be your friends, your family, your neighbors exerting some type of pressure on you to conform your behavior to some expectation. Social media has become a very powerful way in which to not only monitor what people do informally, but to also exert influence on people's behavior. So maybe over the weekend, the first weekend here in November, there was, I know, some social media controversy when I think it was Kendall Jenner, and I get confused with all the different Kardashians and who they are. But there was some controversy around her birthday party, lack of social distancing, which drew a really negative response on her Instagram feed from different users. In the top left-hand corner of the slide is a picture of someone whose name is Rick Rose. He had kind of made a point of very publicly declaring that he would not be wearing masks. And I think this was back in early on in the during COVID, so March or April. That drew a really negative response from people online. Then in late June, early July, so a couple of months later, he announced that he had actually contracted COVID-19. And was struggling to breathe. He would die a few days later on July 4th. His final post on Facebook attracted a large number of comments and people's responses. Many of those responses, even after knowing he had passed away, were quite harsh. That is a lot of, I think there was something in the line of 3,100 ha 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 laughing face emojis, along with criticisms from people who didn't know him. So you can see if you look around at some of the different posts, you've got one of the hashtags that's been trending quite frequently over the last several months is the term COVIDiot, which has been used to call out people, again, who aren't social distancing or wearing masks. You've got the meme in the bottom right-hand corner it's the Toy Story meme, which is quite popular. And this one, it's the COVIDiots everywhere. Conversely, you have some posts urging people not to be mask bullies, pointing out that there might be some cases where people have health conditions and wearing masks isn't quite as feasible. This really is an example of how social media can be used as a social control mechanism, which is something in criminology that we're very interested in. So today, social media offers a window into people's lives that has never previously existed. I can recall a time and day where, as someone who was an older brother, I had a younger sister, and if I wanted to really be a mean older brother, sneaking into her room, stealing her diary, and reading some of the entries to friends about who she might have a crush on was a great way to embarrass her, which would then be followed by getting some kind of punishment, being grounded. You couldn't do that today because most people post those types of things online for everybody to see and read. If we have parties, we like to post those photos. People like to post photos of their meals when they go out. We hashtag everything, and people are watching. And what we've seen over the course of the pandemic is a very harsh response to people who aren't following expectations around, again, social distancing, wearing masks, self-isolating. So I've personally had family members who've had over the summer, for example, small social gatherings where they were social distancing with people that they saw regularly that would have been a part of their social bubble. And they would post those on Instagram, for example, and would get strangers, people they didn't know, responding, very much questioning whether or not what they were doing was safe or if they were putting other people at risk. Another way we could look at social media and how it's been used to kind of control people's behavior during the pandemic is the idea of deviant behavior. So in criminology, obviously, we focus a lot on criminal behavior, things that are illegal, that violate sections of the criminal code. But in between things that are, we'll use the word normal or legal, and those things that are illegal, there's a gray area of behavior where there are certain things that you can engage in or do that, while they might not be illegal, might be considered strange or going against the norm and therefore deviant. So for example, once upon a time, having lots of tattoos or facial piercings might have been considered deviant, and you might have been stigmatized. So we talk about a sociologist, Irving Goffman, who wrote a book quite a while ago where he talked about this concept of stigma. The idea that certain behaviors, it could be physical traits, it could be conditions, it could be things that you have done, are almost like a black mark on you that announces to people that you've done something wrong or against social norms, and disqualifies you to some extent from day-to-day social living. Having a criminal record, being an ex-convict, can be a form of stigma. Whereas for example, when people find out that maybe you've been incarcerated, they might respond to you very negatively. They may not want to associate with you, invite you to parties at their home. You may not get hired for certain jobs. We see this concept of stigma playing out right now during the pandemic. People who are less willing to follow social norms and bylaws around appropriate practices of social distancing and wearing masks are being stigmatized, which has a negative impact. In social media, we've seen in other contexts where people who have made inappropriate statements on Twitter, for example, have suffered consequences. They've lost their jobs. Social media has provided this kind of almost daily 24/7 window into not only what we're doing, but what we think. And it's existed long before there was social media, but there's public responses oftentimes to behavior that's considered deviant, that's intended to informally socially control it. That's what we've been seeing quite a bit during the pandemic. It's not uncommon to see this kind of piling on. If someone makes a statement on Twitter that is unpopular, controversial, or even offensive, And again, as I mentioned, there oftentimes can be real world consequences. So criminology really is a lot more than studying serial killers and theories of crime and policing or the law. It's quite a broad discipline that gives you an opportunity to look at a lot of what's going on in day-to-day life. It's things that we can bring into the classes for assignments, for examples and lectures. That makes the program, in my opinion, an exciting one to be involved with.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. And now we're going to pass it off to Dr. Hannum.
We've been told that during a pandemic, it's safest to just stay home, but criminologists know that this is not true for everyone. We know from past research that stressors in families, including financial hardship, are often linked to increases in conflict and family violence. We know that women and children are most often the victims of family violence. The COVID-19 pandemic has created a situation in which many families are experiencing financial strain, the stress of attempting to manage work and caring for children during school and daycare closures, the absence of supportive family and friends due to physical distancing and self-isolation. On top of this, individuals and families are being asked or required to remain in their homes as much as possible under lockdown orders. And many of the outlets that individuals use for stress relief, like social events, sports activities, are not available to them. Home is not a safe place for many people, and now they're being forced to remain in their homes with an abuser. The pandemic has created a perfect tinderbox for increased domestic violence, and this is being confirmed by the observations and experiences of field workers. Calls to domestic violence and sexual abuse helplines have increased. Many women's shelters are operating at full capacity. The World Health Organization has referred to the increases in domestic violence as a shadow pandemic and recognized that existing situations of domestic and gendered violence have been exacerbated by public health protocols that separate people from their support systems and reduce their options for assistance. Thinking like a criminologist requires thinking critically about the kinds of initiatives that are required to assist people, particularly women and children, who may be trapped in violent situations. We know from research that even the act of disclosing domestic violence or seeking help to leave an abusive situation often escalates abuse and increases the risk of serious injury or homicide. So it's difficult for victims of abuse to reach out for help when they are constantly at home with an abuser. One of the recent innovations to emerge from women's groups was the creation of the signal for help. You may have seen this on social media or in news media. This is a hand signal that can be used on a video call, like Zoom, to discreetly indicate to others that you're experiencing violence in your home and need assistance. We've also seen increased resourcing for text-based services that allow individuals to contact assistance without having to make a phone call that might be overheard. These important innovations of service designed to meet the challenges of the pandemic will continue to be of benefit long after the lockdowns are over. Criminologists like me, who study gender and domestic violence, seek out ways to respond effectively and reduce violence against women and children when home is not a safe place. But other criminologists, like Dr. Day in our department, are working on different problems caused by having no home to go to at all.
All right. Thank you, Stacy. And now we're going to pass it off to Dr. Day.
In March 2020, public health officials and government leaders told us all to stay home, to stay safe, and to flatten the curve of COVID-19. But what are you supposed to do if you don't have a home? While we all moved indoors, many agencies that serve people who are homeless, like food banks, soup kitchens, and drop-in spaces, closed down. Emergency shelters have had to reduce their capacity significantly to meet the 6-foot social distancing requirement between beds. The only shelter in my city has had to cut in half the beds they usually have. Convention centers and gymnasiums were turned into makeshift shelter sites, but most of those have since ended. Because of the shortage in space and the fear people had of shelters as hotspots for the virus to spread, many people who are homeless have had to live outside with little access to spaces for them to wash their hands or to take a shower. People experiencing homelessness already face many health challenges and have an average life expectancy of just 47 years. Living outside and being at risk of catching COVID has made many people's health conditions worse. As a criminologist, I've been following the criminal justice response to homelessness during COVID. With so many more people having to be outside because services are shut down, some cities have seen an increase in calls to police for nuisance behaviors, things like loitering, trespassing, or urinating in public, for example. As makeshift tent cities have popped up to provide safety for people who are sleeping outside, cities across Canada have brought in bylaw and police enforcement to dismantle the camps, oftentimes just moving people from one space to another, as there is still no housing for them to move into. As we approach winter in the second wave of COVID-19, I'm going to be keeping a close eye on how we respond to homelessness and push for non-criminal justice interventions.
Well, thank you very much for that, Erin. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to watch our little presentation today. And we hope to see you soon at Laurier. Take care, everyone.